Good morning, everybody. A very warm welcome to the Thames Valley Chamber Sustainability Working Group's first Zoom call initiative. And the theme of today's Zoom call is Sustainability Development Goals. And I'm delighted that we welcome Louise Hughes, Head of Sustainability and Corporate Responsibility at Ericsson, as our host for today. And our guest speaker is David Simon, Professor of Development Geography from the Royal Holloway, University of London. So I'm going to take this opportunity to hand over to Louise, who's going to start our Zoom call initiative today. Thank you, Louise.
Thank you so much, and really lovely to be here today. Yes, today we're going to talk about the Sustainable Development Goals that have been established by the UN. And actually, interestingly, last year, 2023, was the midpoint for those goals being set and also for when they need to be achieved. And really, they're a global call to action to collaborate on some of the key issues affecting the lovely planet that we live in. So, David, I wanted to start by asking you what your thoughts are on the significance of these goals in today's global world that we live in, and do they really help address the complex challenges that we're facing today?
Thanks, Louise. It's a key question and one which many people have wrestled with over a long period. I think the basic lesson from previous experience, various sets of targets and indicators used by different agencies, but most importantly, the Millennium Development Goals, which effectively were the predecessor set of global goals to the SDGs, was that implementation was somewhat uneven, patchy perhaps, but ultimately that they did stimulate governments and other stakeholders to do things in a slightly more concerted way than might have been the case previously. Having said that, there are many shortcomings of the MDGs which we tried to address in the process of formulating the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, as opposed to the original 8 Millennium Development Goals. And the reason for the increase was precisely to try more accurately and comprehensively to reflect the complexity of sustainability, the different dimensions. One of the key critiques of the MDGs was that they were too simplistic, that they weren't enough, and that they didn't adequately capture many dimensions of things that were important for whatever set of reasons. So, and I say we because I was actually involved in the campaign to create what became Sustainable Development Goal 11 on resilient and sustainable cities and communities. So we can talk about that because that was also the focus of my book. But fundamentally, the point is that the SDGs apply to all countries, whereas the MDGs applied only to low and lower middle income countries, which basically means if we look at the data both from 2016, which was the first year of implementation, and the midterm review last year, which you alluded to in your intro, Louise, there's work to be done. And effectively, all countries, regardless of quality of life, levels of material well-being, disposable income, household income, whichever indicators you use, all countries still have work to do. So there isn't a single country on the planet that could reasonably define itself today as truly sustainable. And indeed, even the ones that are furthest down the track, which are the Nordic countries, Iceland and so on, and Sweden, Norway, Japan is quite high too. They are not currently meeting more than about 45% of the targets and indicators across the 17 development goals. As I said, in Sweden, shortly after the start of the exercise, the implication of this is actually that all countries are now defined as developing countries. And that raised some eyebrows because people don't think about it that way, but that exactly illustrates the point. It's a tool or a set of tools to get us to shake up our kind of comfort zones a little bit and to realize that there's a lot of work to do. And that is true of all sectors, private, public, third sector, civil society as a whole, and at all scales from the global, transnational companies like your own, international agencies, right down to small and medium enterprises, such as the majority of members of the Thames Valley Chamber.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's a real kind of collaborative effort, isn't it? And so how do businesses in the Thames Valley take those big global goals and that topic of, developing, always developing, moving forward that you mentioned, and how do we kind of bring it to life in the Thames Valley, and how by using these goals can we be more effective in trying to be more sustainable as businesses and organizations?
Right. Again, there is a challenge of scale. It's very tempting for individuals or households to say, oh, well, if I switch off the light or I recycle my aluminium cans and my glass bottles, it's going to make no difference globally because there are 7.5 billion people all doing their own thing, all contributing to pollution or depletion of resources, whatever. And what I can do is irrelevant. Well, that's not true because all of us can and do bear some responsibility for what is happening. And the only way we're going to change is if all of us play a role. So one of the key reasons why the Sustainability Working Group prioritized the small and medium enterprise sector when we were launched about, 2.5, maybe 3 years ago now, was the recognition from our initial work among the membership at large that it was particularly the SME sector who lacked both the capacity and perhaps the knowledge and the time amongst the small number of staff to address such complex challenges. Larger companies, be they regional or national or like yours, international, are often quite well equipped, may even have specialist people, devoted departments or programs to address them. But the responses we got from our surveys from within the SME sector, and of course, conscious that's a very diverse one, it's not homogeneous at all, is that if you're employing a handful of people, they're hands-on on a daily basis doing the core business, and they don't have the time or the capacity in whatever sense to explore, to examine, to try to figure out how to become more resource efficient, how to move towards economic circularity, how to reduce the carbon footprint and start thinking about meeting the scope 1, then scope 2, and then scope 3 emissions reductions target in order to meet net zero. So that became the core challenge that we took up in the SWG and have targeted a set of tools and then followed up with a survey, many of the results of which, incidentally, are reflected in the Chamber's State of the Region report, which was published late last year and is available on the website. So you can get more detailed information. You can see summary findings there and elsewhere on the Chamber's website. But it's fundamental that even the small and medium enterprises, perhaps employing only 2 or 3 people, don't sort of duck it or say, oh, it's too big, it's too complex, no can do. We all need to do. And there are actually increasing legal requirements to report on certain things. And the sooner that people start to do that, to understand the terminology, the language, and what can be done, the more likely they are to achieve some of the targets, at least, in real time.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe we'll talk a little bit more about those specific sort of actions that you talk about that small, medium businesses can take, because there's a lot of regulation, isn't there, coming out, and sometimes it can feel a little bit overwhelming. And I'm lucky to work for an organization that was sort of doing sustainability, you might say, long before it was mandated. So it's kind of more embedded in the culture. And I suppose we kind of approach it as any other business imperative. So we set a target, we have milestones, and then we communicate the progress. So how might you sort of specific actions or strategies that you might suggest that businesses across the Thames Valley could think about while advancing their own business interests? How can they kind of link it intrinsically to their business?
I suppose one of the crucial things is, again, a slight shift of mindset, because most firms and many individuals and households have been sort of brought up, educated, be it formally through economics or management business training at university or college, or in any other way, to think in terms of what we refer to as a linear economic process. In other words, resources are mined somewhere, they are processed, they are integrated into complex products of whatever sort, they're used once or twice or for a limited period. their use is finished. And the most extreme, of course, is disposable crockery, cutlery, coffee cups that you get at, takeaways, whatever. And then you ditch. And then they are traditionally sent to landfill, which is both wasteful and depletes the land available. It could contribute to toxicity of the groundwater and all that sort of thing. And then you buy more. And that is underpinned, on the one hand, by a very outdated form of conventional economic theory, policy, and practice, but fundamentally also the idea that resources are limitless. But we've known for decades that there are, to quote the phrase of a famous Club of Rome book of the 1960s, limits to growth. And increasingly, the science is focusing on planetary boundaries, safe operating spaces for humanity and indeed the planet as a whole. And economic theory, policy, and practice is driving us much more towards circularity, which simplistically, many people will have heard the 3 R's, reduce, reuse, recycle, which is part of it, but not all of it. And underpinning that is an essential shift of thinking from something that we've used as a waste product, as a cost to dispose of, but to think of it instead as a resource for something else or someone else. Yeah. So your waste could become a recycled, repurposed, upcycled product through a repair shop or through some kind of industrial processing and become a feedstock or an input to another process rather than going to landfill. And we've all been doing the recycling of cans, glass, paper, and so on for a long, long time. It's increasing as a proportion of the total. So landfill is reducing, at least per capita. But there's more to be done. Similarly, thinking about renewable energy. We did a piece of work as part of that project on that issue. Most suppliers offer green tariffs, which doesn't mean that despite the publicity, that what you get when you switch on your light is somehow generated renewably through solar panels or hydro or wind turbines, whatever. But what it means is that the providers and the grid as a whole are increasing the proportion of renewables that are generated, and that in turn is feeding into the system as a whole. And as more and more of that happens, we're transitioning. And over the last 2 summers, the UK has actually generated more through renewables than it has through fossil fuel-driven production. And that's quite an important change. Not everybody as a household or an SME can necessarily afford to put solar panels on the roof or have a micro turbine in the backyard, so to speak, to generate their own electricity. But there are opportunities to get green tariffs or increasingly also, given the pressure on the electricity grid as a whole in this country, to develop microgrids. In fact, I was involved in a conversation with one of the main electricity companies and local authority partners just yesterday on this, that putting up panels, solar arrays, or turbines to generate power to feed into the grid is a costly and time-consuming process with lots of delays. But if you are on a light industrial estate or you're a farm with a few light industries adjacent, you could actually become self-sufficient to a large extent through a microgrid and then just have a connection to the grid to offload excess, or if there's not enough being generated in winter or whatever, you can buy in and thereby reduce your total expenditure on electricity on a recurrent basis, assuming that you've been able to finance either through reserves or through a loan the capital cost of investment. But even there are ways around it, because there are electricity suppliers who effectively will rent your roof space or plot of land to install renewables and pay you rent for that and also a certain percentage of the offtake that is generated. So there are multiple ways in which even a small producer, a household, can buy into this and reduce costs in the medium term without necessarily incurring the full capital cost themselves. There are numerous other examples, but that's perhaps one of the most significant, because we all rely on energy for all sorts of things, including increasingly charging electric vehicles.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love both the examples, energy and the circular example that you use there, because it talks about taking sort of an issue maybe derived from, I don't know, material scarcity linked to circular economy, and it turns it into a, how can you take this issue and come up with a solution that actually makes you a bit more resilient? You know, so you're not so reliant on these things, but also then you've also talked about opportunities, new business opportunities,
Indeed.
new business models, which I think's really interesting. And I maybe you touched on a couple of them there, but your book that you've recently written is talking about, you know, urban areas and things we can do to create more inclusive and sustainable areas. So why, or how might that manifest in the Thames Valley region, and why is that goal SDG 11 sort of linked to the book? And maybe you could just explain that to me a little bit.
Well, there is the book. It's available online, open electronically as well as in paper. But essentially, the majority of humanity worldwide live in areas defined as urban, and an even higher percentage would live on the fringes of urban areas in the sort of rural-urban interface or peri-urban areas, or whatever we might choose to call them in different contexts. And therefore, if we are to be sustainable globally or as an individual country or society defined in different ways, that's not going to happen unless urban areas and their city regions, if you like, perhaps most usefully, are sustainable. But again, urban areas are not islands. They are fundamentally part of the wider territories, administrative areas, local government areas, countries of which they are, or within which they are situated. And therefore, the idea is fundamentally that all components of society need to be sustainable. You can't have a sustainable island in a toxic sea, so to speak, as an analogy, or the other way around. You can't have a clean ocean or sea with a toxic island, because it's going to leak, it's going to leach, there are going to be discharges into the water that will be polluted. And that I always find quite a useful metaphor for the complexities of this. And as a consequence, it is really important that all components of society, so global agencies, intergovernmental organizations, and hence these are UN goals, orchestrated and being driven by the respective specialist agencies. So Goal 11 is driven by UN Habitat, which is the specialist human settlements agency of the UN. Some are driven by the United Nations Environment Programme or UN Development Programme or the World Health Organization, World Meteorological Organization. So again, to bring specialist expertise to bear. But they have to be implemented and adopted at all scales. So national governments have bought into the process as part of signing up to Agenda 2030, of which the SDGs are, if you like, the monitoring and evaluation framework. They have implemented a series of programs on climate change, on sustainability, on resilience, on education, health, all the sort of more sectoral issues, but linked to effectively programs to try to achieve as many as possible of the Sustainable Development Goals. Then in turn, regional and local governments are required to do the same. So in the UK, for example, all local authorities, and how this works differs according to whether you have unitary authorities, as is the case in Berkshire, or where I am in Surrey, it's still a two-tier structure with county councils and then a series of boroughs and districts beneath them. But between them, they also have to implement strategies like this. So every local authority in the UK now, linked to the SDGs, linked to the broader environmental and sustainability constraints, meeting the net zero targets of the Paris Agreement and so on, have to have a sustainability strategy, a resilience strategy, policies on blue-green infrastructure, on biodiversity net gain, and local nature recovery, just to give you a series of examples linked to what we're talking about. And in January this year, Surrey County Council followed up its recently adopted sustainability and climate change strategies with a program called Surrey Adapt, which is all about adaptation to climate change and promotion of sustainability linked to the greener future component of their overall county strategy. And there are 9 priority programs, of which one is the resilient economy. And essentially, under that, it's about encouraging innovation and risk reduction to climate-proof the local economy. So that's just one of 9, all of which are interrelated, and we can put a diagram in the video clip that will show this. It's a rather nice wheel diagram and how all the different components interrelate. And that's where, again, it comes then down to the borough councils, it comes down to chambers of commerce such as Thames Valley to coordinate and to encourage firms. And some authorities are going further than others, but in relation, for example, to net zero, there will be targets, there will be compliance issues. And the more that we can focus on the internal stuff, which is scope 1, the core operations of every enterprise, that will then be translated the next stage to scope 2, which includes the essential journeys beyond the physical premises of the building to do the operations. And then eventually we get to scope 3, which then encompasses not just our journeys to work, but the whole supply chain. And that is by far the most complex. It's the one that there is so far least expertise available to guide us through. Because if you are, I'll just take where I work, a modest-sized university, every day of the week we have umpteen post and parcel delivery vans, you know, the parcel deliveries, never mind Royal Mail. We have vast numbers of food supply vehicles coming in to supply the retail outlets on campus, to supply the residential and catering services, providing meals to both staff and the students, both day students and in the halls of residence. We have a big estates department responsible for the maintenance of the buildings, the gardens, the landscape, and all the rest of it. And then, of course, commuting, parents dropping off students, collecting students, beginning and end of term, and so on and so forth. So actually trying to get a handle on all that and integrate it all is an immensely complicated challenge, logistically as well as practically. And there will be guidance produced over the coming years. And indeed, I sit on a working group with our estates team, with our borough council and our county council, because we're trying to do this as a sort of joined up venture, because we're all learning as we do, to quote a phrase. But those are some of the challenges. But we have to start with what we can control, what is simplest, because that will also get us into that different mindset and hopefully enable us thereby better to deal with the rest of it. But the trick, and this is where many local authorities, whether it's the Greater London Authority, with ULEZ and so on, are struggling, is to find something that is sufficiently nuanced rather than a blunt mallet to make a difference and take account of people's different circumstances, or the different circumstances in different parts of the expanded ULEZ zone, for example. So where I am, just beyond the GLA boundary, there are numerous places in a sort of average working day or doing other things where I would normally have crossed into the GLA for a few hundred meters along a road, or to pick someone up and come straight out. But I would have to pay the same £12.50 charge as somebody living and working in central London with a van, assuming it's not ULEZ compliant, driving around all day, making multiple stops and deliveries, and making a hugely different contribution to air pollution, congestion, and so on. So it's not sufficiently nuanced, and that's why there's been so much opposition. Similarly, if we are going to try to get people to engage in more active transport, cycling, walking, or a combination, we need to ensure that there are safe and accessible cycle routes, that there are hire bikes available and affordable places accessible. It's on an easy-to-use app. If we're going to go towards some of the other apps that encourage people to leave their cars at home and use public transport, again, that cannot be successful until we have sufficiently frequent, reliable, accessible, and affordable public transport. The problem is it's difficult to provide those until there's enough ridership to make them sustainable with a modest level of subsidy. So we're often in catch-22s. And those are some of the very real challenges that we're all going to have to work through. And nobody is going to be able to do it alone. Hence, again, the importance of multi-stakeholder, multi-partner operations, maybe even firms within the same industrial park, for example, clubbing together to provide shuttle bus services to the railway station, or ensure that there is on-site catering so people aren't running off in their own cars at lunchtime to go to a restaurant somewhere else, or a cafe or whatever. All those sort of things need a bit of a mind shift if we're going to make that kind of progress.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can't let you do those examples without putting a little pitch in here for the role that ICT can play as well in helping to decarbonize these industries. Because I think, you talk there lots of examples of how we could maybe be a bit more intelligent about our operations, or use data to think about how we might make decisions when it comes to foundational infrastructure and things like that. And we did some research a couple of years ago to show that ICT does have the potential to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by up to 15% by 2030. And that's old IT that already exists today. So that's not even adding, 5G or the other things on the top of that. So I think, I love what you're saying there about the collaboration of all the players. So it's not just, these governmental goals that are national, it comes down to a regional level, you have the private sector. Maybe could you give me an example of any companies that you've seen that are incorporating these SDGs, the big United Nations SDGs, into their local business strategies? And what could other businesses in the Thames Valley kind of learn from how they've done that, or what's going well?
I don't want to name names, but I think as a generalization, there are fewer in the UK, partly because the national government over the last number of years has not really prioritized the SDGs. And most metropolitan and large urban local governments have their own sets of indicators, but there are some that are leading in this. Perhaps the best example is Bristol with their One Bristol strategy. They have embraced the SDGs, and therefore more firms there are engaging directly with it. Again, the city is in partnership with chambers of commerce and other stakeholders, and it's a very different ball game from most of the others. I think Milton Keynes does quite a good job in the same way, but on the other, as do some of the so-called transition towns at a sort of smaller scale, linked to fair trade and longer traditions of rethinking how we live and work, promoting sustainability, recycling, and having repair shops and that sort of thing. But if you go to the continent, Sweden, Germany, which are two of the countries in Europe that put themselves forward in 2015 as models of SDG implementation, it follows from that they have produced guidelines for local authorities, regional authorities, engagement with the private sector. And if you go and look at some of the major German, Swedish corporations, and all the way down to SMEs, this kind of thinking is much more fundamentally embedded in everything from their strategy. If you look at their sort of 5-year plans, if you look at their CSR reports and so on, it's there, and isn't in most cases just greenwash. There is much more of that in this country, frankly. But in those countries and many others, it's very real. And part of that is about what I alluded to earlier on in our conversation, thinking about, for example, waste as a resource rather than as a problem to be thrown away and got rid of at least cost. So you can actually generate a revenue stream through sorting your waste, undertaking contracts with firms that will then reprocess them in whatever sense, whether it's organic waste for composting, whether it's your scrap cardboard and paper that goes back into the pulp and paper industry, or whatever. And the example I gave about energy. And by doing that, they are, first of all, reducing their overall resource use. They are reducing their waste, in some cases, effectively close to zero, certainly waste to landfill. Their reliance on the grid for energy has been hugely reduced. And crucially, they pay great attention to the supply chain. So they pay attention, again, beyond lip service, to sourcing from fair trade sources, from sustainably harvested wood or other materials that go into whatever it is that are their core operations. They have greatly reduced the use of plastics, which again are generally derived from fossil fuels. They recycle the plastics. If they use them, they make sure or produce them that they are fully recyclable. And just to close that loop, in this country, one of our problems is that many materials are actually recyclable. If you look on your plastic container, there is the recyclable, and it'll tell you it's LPDE or PDAG or whatever. But depending which of the 46 different local authority recycling contract areas you live in, those particular plastics, and by extension other goods as well, may or may not be recyclable. So I live in an area where it's better than it used to be, but we're still told not to put polystyrene into the recycling, even if it has that recyclable logo on it, and many other things. Whereas in those countries where this is taken much more seriously and is a much more sophisticated program, there'll be nothing that is potentially recyclable that you cannot put into one or other of your recycling, reuse, whatever, repurposing waste streams. And that generates more revenue. And that is part of the economic circularity. And that is really the shift from thinking in the first instance to action that somehow we need to galvanize people to achieve, and where multi-stakeholder organizations like chambers of commerce, but also working with local authorities, with people in those particular recycling circularity chains, can make such a crucial difference. Urban food production is another good example where vertical farms, green roof farms are increasingly making appearance in our area, and in most cases are actually proving commercially viable because they're effective. They use space that otherwise would be underutilized. They massively reduce food miles and therefore the energy content, and so on. But there are constraints, and that's a very rapidly growing experimental field. And I know of some that have been unsuccessful experiments, but that's the direction of travel, as they say.
Yeah, and I think it comes back to what you were saying before about mind shift, doesn't it? What you've just been describing is just a different way of looking at things, and a different opportunity. We have Ericsson, and we're Swedish, so it's lovely to hear you reference that. But we have 100,000 employees, so we have lots and lots of people, but lots of people also eager to play their part and understand the role that they can play, both at work, at home, with customers that they work with. So we decided that climate action is a critical skill. So we have a big kind of learning and development program as part of that. But how can sort of governments and private sector work together to support the wider community in the Thames Valley to take the next step and know what to do next? Big question.
Well,
probably.
it requires, in most cases, it requires people in key positions within the respective organizations. So somebody in your position in a large firm like Ericsson UK, and your counterparts in other countries. In local authorities, it requires somebody in each of the key departments, which aren't necessarily those that are called climate change or sustainability, but more generally, so in different departments, who kind of get the message, who see this as important and can drive it forward. Because if it's just one lone voice, that person rapidly gets kind of marginalized, or people say, oh, don't worry, just eccentric, or it's always banging on about it. But if you've got a group of people, and crucially can make the shift in thinking that we've been talking about, that waste is a resource, not something rubbish to be got rid of, that there is money to be made, that there are resources to be saved, and that it's good business, as with economic circularity. That's the game changer. And there are numerous examples where that has been shown to shift thinking. Working through children at school is also always effective. and I've seen this in many parts of the world, sort of higher primary or lower secondary in particular, where if these sorts of issues like climate change, like sustainability, caring for your rivers and green open spaces can be brought into the syllabus, not necessarily as some specialized, good citizenship or global citizenship module, although sometimes they are quite successful, but linked to the relevant part, say, of the science syllabus, where you're doing work, or geography, or whichever field fits in that particular syllabus. That then raises the awareness of children. If you can give them practical experience, more and more schools are having little kitchen gardens, for example, or scouts and Girl Guides, for example, also do this either around their huts, or they go out and they help pick litter or help to decongest clogged rivers with pollution or waste linked to other voluntary organizations. That then almost invariably means that they go home and they talk to their parents of, why are you throwing that away? Why are you not doing that? Why da, 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 da. And so parents start to change their behavior. And if enough people do it, then that can catalyze neighborhood or village or suburb level change. And crucially, that then means that you're putting pressure on your elected representatives. So again, I was at a meeting last night, which was non-party political. It was in fact about climate change. It just so happened that candidates from many parties who are standing tomorrow in our local government election were there. And, it's very clear that more and more people are contacting their candidates, or post-election, their elected representatives, and highlighting the priority on environment, sustainability, climate change sets of issues, mediated, of course, by affordability. And that comes back to what I said at the beginning, that we have to have sufficiently well nuanced policies, and where elected representatives who get the message can be important, so that you get the right policies that then move us forward, rather than something that is too blunt an instrument and creates hostility and resentment and probably sets us back.
Absolutely. So, David, thank you so much. This has been really, really interesting conversation. I think we're coming to the end of the discussion, but it would be good just to maybe loop back to the book. I live in the Thames Valley, so I'm very passionate about how we make this more inclusive and sustainable society here. What are the people? What would you like people to sort of take away from the book? And maybe you could just summarize for us, and we can end it there.
Well, one of the key, two of the key themes of the book are about how it's essential to localize the SDGs. So, they're formulated at the global level. I mentioned how national governments, regional governments, and so on have to incorporate them. But of course, towns, cities, all areas and communities are hugely diverse around the world. So there's been a clear and reasonably coherent process of localization to make them locally relevant, using local variables, or using only some that seem to make most sense or most practicable in a particular context. That does open the risk of cherry picking, where we just do the things that are politically convenient, show us in the best light, but don't actually challenge us. But that's kind of, debasing the currency, if you like. The idea is to challenge us, but to challenge us constructively to make those changes. The second key message is a bit like, climate change, is to think about this not as something in a silo on its own that's got a price tag in addition to all the other things that we have to do with their own price tags, but something that is integrated with and cross-cutting, so that it is part of everything we do. And that's why, as I mentioned a few moments ago, we need champions in different departments of local government, or different sections of a company, because it's got to be joined up. In fact, I'm generally of the opinion, on the basis of experience, that if you put it into a box on its own, whoa, we have a climate change department, whoa, we have a sustainability department, that's probably ineffective, or less effective than it would be if somebody in every department, whether it's the manufacturing or the sales or the client-facing services or whatever, has this as part of their roles and responsibilities, on which they have to report in their annual report or in their team meetings, however frequently they may occur. That's how you mainstream it. But crucially, too, that's how you achieve co-benefits. And so part of the piece in relation to the SDGs, and a big part of the book, is identifying where you can get co-benefits most easily through so-called synergies, where you can make one investment or one intervention that achieves a bunch of benefits, not just on the immediate subject, but because of the way in which everything's interrelated, and conversely trying to minimize the trade-offs. And there will be some inevitably where you are faced with a choice. I can either do this or I can do that, but they don't fit. But actually, if you look and analyze systematically, and this comes back again to localize it to the Thames Valley, part of the job we were doing with and for the SME sector in the Sustainability Working Group over the last couple of years is to identify some of those where you get what people like to call a win-win, or you get multiple benefits for one investment. So you minimize the trade-offs, you maximize the synergies, but crucially, you get away from the silos where each one has a separate price tag and you've got to do all or nothing sort of thing. You can integrate it, and then you do a whole lot of things with a marginal increase in most cases to your overall cost, but particularly if you're valorizing your waste, so that becomes a revenue source. You can feed that into the equation as well. And that's how, on the basis of experience around the world, not just in the UK, you can actually make substantial progress without actually feeling the kind of pain that the climate change skeptics and the deniers would have us believe.
Really great summary of how to operate as a responsible business. And I can just talk to when we established our net zero goals, rather than having the sustainability team lead them, they're actually led by the people that manufacture the product. So the product that needs to be, lower in emissions, using less energy. It's not, as you say, just the job of the sustainability team to make sure that happens. It's the job of the people that work with customers, get what their feedback, what they want, build them, get all of the, source all of the materials, the whole chain, which makes it a lot more inclusive. And everybody has their part to play.
Exactly.
David, thank you so much. Really lovely talking with you.
Pleasure. Great
So we'll end
to
it
talk
there.
with you, and let's see how our audiences respond.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.